March 1945. A German reconnaissance pilot adjusts his camera, capturing what looks like intelligence gold. An entire American armoured division near the Rhine River. Hundreds of tanks, rows of artillery. This discovery will redirect thousands of German troops. There's just one problem. Those tanks weigh 93 pounds each. The artillery can be folded up and stuffed in a duffel bag. The entire division is a magnificent lie. Welcome to the strangest battlefield of World War II, where 1,100 artists and sound engineers fought the Nazis with rubber tanks and audio recordings. They called themselves the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. History knows them as the Ghost Army. Between D-Day and VE Day, these combat con artists staged over 20 battlefield deceptions, saving an estimated 30,000 lives, not by destroying enemy positions, but by creating positions that never existed, and then they vanished from history itself, sworn to secrecy for 50 years. If you enjoy uncovering history's most improbable secrets, consider subscribing and letting us know where you're listening from. I'm curious to know who else knows that sometimes the mightiest weapon on the battlefield is the ability to make your enemy believe a lie. Now take a slow, deep breath. Settle into your cozier spot. Let the outside world fade away as we go back to where this magnificent madness began, to a classified ad that might as well have read, "Artists wanted, must be willing to lie to Nazis." In 1943, deep in the sound laboratories of Bell Telephone Company, a group of engineers made a discovery that would have seemed more at home in a magic show than a military facility. They had figured out how to capture the soul of an armoured division, not its men or machines, but its sound, its auditory presence, the rumbling mechanical symphony that announced its arrival long before it came into view. The demonstration was simple, almost absurd. They had recorded the sounds of tanks at Fort Knox, the distinctive clatter of treads on different surfaces, the deep-throated rumble of engines, the metallic protests of tons of steel in motion. Then, using speakers that would have made any jazz club owner weep with envy, they played it back. The effect was uncanny. Close your eyes, and you would swear that just beyond those laboratory walls, an entire armoured column was rolling past. At first, the military brass who witnessed these demonstrations weren't quite sure what to make of it. The idea seemed to belong more to the realm of Hollywood than to the serious business of warfare. Creating fake sounds to fool the enemy? It sounded like something out of a children's adventure story, not a legitimate military strategy. But as the war ground on, as every advantage became precious, as deception proved its worth in operations like the British Operation Bertram at El Alamein, minds began to change. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was room on the battlefield for artists alongside soldiers. The masterminds behind what would become the Ghost Army were as unlikely a pair as the idea itself. Colonel Billy Harris was everything you'd expect from a career military officer. West Point educated, ramrod straight, a man who probably ironed his socks. Major Ralph Ingersoll, on the other hand, was a creature from an entirely different world, the former managing editor of The New Yorker, publisher of Fortune magazine. He was described by colleagues as a bright guy who was such a goddamned liar that he took to military deception, as they said, like a duck to water. Together, this odd couple conceived of something unprecedented in American military history, a unit dedicated entirely to tactical deception, a mobile magic show that could create entire divisions out of thin air and sound waves. When General Jacob Devers gave his approval on Christmas Eve 1943, he was authorizing what would become one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. The connection to Hollywood wasn't just metaphorical. Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the swashbuckling movie star turned naval officer, had been developing similar concepts based on his knowledge of movie special effects. His experience with creating illusions on film translated surprisingly well to creating illusions on the battlefield. The Ghost Army would literally be applying Hollywood magic to military operations, a perfect fusion of American entertainment and American military might. But now they faced a different challenge. Where do you find soldiers for an army of ghosts? You couldn't simply grab the strongest recruits from boot camp. You needed men who could think in perspectives and shadows, who understood the art of illusion, who could paint a convincing picture, literally. And so began perhaps the most unusual recruitment drive in military history. While other units sent their recruiters to farms and factories, the Ghost Army sent theirs to art schools. Picture, if you will, the scene at Pratt Institute in New York in early 1944. Young men who had been learning to draw the human form and mix the perfect shade of cerulean blue suddenly found army recruiters in their hallways. But these weren't looking for marksmen or machine gunners. The entrance exam for this unit wasn't push-ups or rifle assembly. It was something far more surreal. The prospective recruits were handed paper and pencils and given a simple instruction: draw a self-portrait. You have 15 minutes. The room filled with the scratch of pencils on paper as confused art students tried to capture their own faces while processing the absurdity of the moment. Here they were, potentially joining the United States Army based on their ability to render a decent nose and capture the shadows under their own eyes. Some later recalled wondering if this was all an elaborate prank. It wasn't. The 15-minute self-portrait was a brilliantly designed test. It showed not just artistic skill, but speed, the ability to work under pressure, and the capacity to capture essential details quickly. All skills that would prove vital when sketching enemy positions or rapidly creating convincing military insignia. The recruiters fanned out across the country's creative institutions: Cooper Union in New York, the Cleveland Institute of Art, art schools in Philadelphia and Chicago. They were shopping for a very specific kind of soldier, one who could wield a paintbrush as effectively as a rifle, who understood that perspective could be a weapon, that illusion could save lives. At the Cleveland Institute of Art, flyers appeared on hallway walls advertising camouflage courses. Pratt Institute, prescient as always, had actually established an industrial camouflage program back in 1940, making their students particularly attractive to this strange new unit. John Jarvie, a student at Cooper Union, remembered the buzz that went through the school when word spread that the army was recruiting artists for something special, something secret. The men who answered this call were a glorious collection of misfits and future luminaries. There was Bill Blass, who would trade his army-issued sewing kit for a fashion empire. Ellsworth Kelly, who had become one of America's most celebrated abstract painters, but first had to learn to paint inflatable tanks. Arthur Singer, whose delicate watercolours of birds would one day grace postage stamps, but who first had to master the art of making fake military equipment look weathered and battle-worn. But it wasn't just fresh-faced art students who filled the ranks. The unit became an unexpected meeting ground between generations. Alongside the 18-year-old painters were 40-year-old advertising executives from Madison Avenue, men who had spent careers selling soap and cigarettes and were now being asked to sell something far more ambitious: the illusion of American military might. One veteran later joked that World War II was the first war where the advertising department got its own unit. The basic training for this unit was a comedy of errors that would have made a fine theatrical production itself. Here were men who had spent their lives learning that the pen, or paintbrush, was mightier than the sword, suddenly being asked to at least pretend they knew which end of a rifle to hold. The future fashion designer trying to master the art of marching, the abstract painter learning to salute, the watercolourist attempting to look fierce during bayonet drills. One veteran later recalled the absurdity of it all. Artists who could capture the play of light on water struggling to manage a proper about face. Men who understood the golden ratio being baffled by military time. The drill sergeants, accustomed to moulding farm boys and factory workers into soldiers, found themselves dealing with recruits who wanted to discuss the aesthetic qualities of camouflage patterns. The age gap created its own comedy. The young art students, full of avant-garde ideas and modernist sensibilities, found themselves bunking with advertising men who thought cubism was something you put in drinks. The ad executives, used to 3-martini lunches, discovered that the army's idea of creativity didn't include expense accounts. Yet somehow, this unlikely mixture began to cohere into something unique. But beneath the comedy was something profound. The army had made a calculated bet that in modern warfare, the ability to deceive could be as valuable as the ability to destroy. They were gambling that creativity could be weaponized, that imagination could be mobilized, that the skills learned in art studios and advertising agencies could be transformed into a new kind of combat effectiveness. By the spring of 1944, this unlikely army was taking shape at Campfire, Tennessee. Officially, they were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a name so bland it could have been a supply unit or a typing pool. Unofficially, they were already becoming something else, a collection of creative minds preparing to wage war with rubber and recordings, perspective and performance. They were divided into 4 specialized units, each with its own peculiar specialty. The 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion would handle the visual deceptions, the inflatable tanks and fake artillery that would become their signature. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company would manage the sonic deception, turning those Bell Labs recordings into battlefield symphonies. The Signal Company Special would handle radio deception, creating false networks of communication, and the 406th Combat Engineer Company would provide security and handle the genuine military work that inevitably accompanied their theatrical performances. Together, these 1,100 men formed something unprecedented, a unit where the average IQ was reportedly 119, where spare time was spent sketching and painting rather than playing cards, where discussions might range from the proper way to weather an inflatable Sherman tank to the philosophical implications of warfare through art. They spent months training, learning not just their strange specialties but how to integrate them into a seamless performance. They studied the units they would impersonate, memorizing insignia and vehicle markings, radio protocols and movement patterns. They learned to think like directors staging a play, but a play where a bad review could mean enemy shells landing on real soldiers. As they prepared to ship out to Europe, these artist soldiers carried with them more than the usual military equipment. Yes, they had rifles they hoped never to fire and helmets they hoped would never stop shrapnel. But they also carried sketch pads and watercolours, recordings of tanks that didn't exist, and rubber facsimiles of America's mighty war machine. They were about to attempt something that had never been tried on this scale, to fight a war with illusion, to save lives with lies, to defeat the enemy by making them see things that weren't there. The Ghost Soldiers were ready for their European debut. The question was Europe ready for them? The answer would come soon enough, on the battlefields of Normandy, where their opening night would teach them that creating an illusion while people are shooting at you is considerably more challenging than doing it in an art studio. August 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy had already claimed thousands of lives, their ancient earthen walls turning the French countryside into a deadly maze. Into this labyrinth came the Ghost Army, about to stage their first performance in what theatre people call opening night. Except this theatre came with German artillery as critics. Operation Elephant. Even the code name had a certain absurdist poetry to it. The mission was conceptually simple. The 2nd Armoured Division needed to move to a new position without the Germans noticing. The Ghost Army would inherit their abandoned spot, maintaining the illusion that 30,000 tons of American armour remained exactly where it had been. Simple in concept, somewhat more challenging when you realise that your primary tool for impersonating a tank battalion was a bicycle pump. Picture the scene as darkness fell on that August evening. Real tanks, massive and purposeful, rumbling away under cover of night, their engines muffled, their crews maintaining strict radio silence, and rolling in behind them, like understudies taking the stage, came the Ghost Army with their peculiar cargo. Trucks loaded with what looked like giant rubber pool toys, soldiers carrying speakers the size of refrigerators, men whose primary weapons were air compressors and tape recordings. The choreography of deception began immediately. In the darkness, soldiers unfolded their rubber Shermans, the hiss of bicycle pumps filling the air like a strange mechanical breathing. Each inflatable tank took 20 minutes to fully inflate. 20 minutes of hoping the distinctive sound wouldn't carry to German lines. 20 minutes of wrestling with rubber and canvas in the dark. 20 minutes of transforming a deflated pile into something that would, from a distance, fool reconnaissance planes and observers. But Murphy's Law, that patron saint of military operations, was in full attendance for this opening night. A gust of Norman wind caught one of the 93-pound tanks, sending it tumbling across a field like the world's most expensive tumbleweed. The sight of soldiers chasing after a bouncing tank in the darkness would have been comedy gold in any other circumstance. Here, it was potentially catastrophic. One wrong bounce into enemy territory, one German patrol finding a rubber tank, and the entire deception would unravel. The inflatable learning curve was steep and unforgiving. The tanks, so perfect in the controlled environment of Camp Forest, proved to have personalities of their own in the field. They sagged in the heat. They collected water in unfortunate places when it rained, causing them to list drunkenly to one side. They required constant adjustment and maintenance, like temperamental actors who needed continuous attention to stay in character. But the visual deception was only one layer of this elaborate performance. The Ghost Army understood that convincing the enemy required what they called atmosphere, all the little details that make a military presence feel real. Soldiers donned the shoulder patches of the 2nd Armoured Division, becoming instant imposters. They drove jeeps in careful patterns, creating the dust clouds and track marks that would suggest heavy traffic. They hung laundry on improvised lines, because even tough tank crews need clean socks. The method acting went deeper still. Selected soldiers were sent into the nearby town of Cerisy-la-Forêt with a very specific mission: get drunk and talk too much. These atmosphere officers, as they informally called themselves, would loudly discuss the upcoming offensive, complain about their tank maintenance duties, and generally spread disinformation with the dedication of professional actors. One veteran later described it with typical Ghost Army humour, being paid by the United States Army to sit in French cafes, drink wine, and tell lies. He noted it was the best job he'd ever had. As night deepened, the sonic unit went to work. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company had finally arrived from England with their arsenal of acoustic weaponry. The speakers, each weighing 500 pounds and capable of projecting sound up to 15 miles, were carefully positioned and camouflaged. Then, like DJs at the world's strangest dance party, they began their set. The night air filled with the recorded sounds of the 2nd Armoured Division. Tanks' engines rumbling to life, the clatter of maintenance work, sergeants barking orders, the actual profanity-laced commands recorded at Fort Knox, because authenticity mattered. The metallic symphony of an armoured unit at rest. All of it a ghostly echo of forces that were now miles away. But Operation Elephant was teaching them hard lessons with every passing hour. Their first major realization: their deception was too good. The inflatable tanks were camouflaged so perfectly that German reconnaissance planes were having difficulty spotting them. What good was a deception if the enemy couldn't see what you wanted them to see? They needed the Germans to discover their secret position, to feel clever for having spotted these hidden American forces. The second lesson came courtesy of the local French population. Security, it turned out, was nearly impossible in the liberated areas of France. Civilians, curious and grateful for liberation, wandered freely through areas that should have been restricted. The moment that crystallized this problem came when a French farmer, walking through what he thought was an American tank position, decided to rest by leaning against one of the Sherman tanks. The look on his face as the tank barrel bent under his weight was, veterans recalled, worth the price of admission, but it also represented a critical vulnerability. Word spread quickly in small French towns. If civilians could discover the deception, how long before that information reached German intelligence? The Ghost Army adapted on the fly, turning even this challenge into part of their performance. When civilians discovered the truth, soldiers would put their fingers to their lips, smile conspiratorially, and whisper, "secret weapon," or "very hush hush." Most French civilians, eager to help their liberators and thrilled to be part of a secret, kept quiet. Some even began spreading their own rumours about American secret weapons, inadvertently adding another layer to the deception. But not everyone was so easily managed. The French resistance, those brave souls who'd been risking their lives to gather intelligence, created an unexpected complication. Local resistance members, doing their duty, reported back to Allied intelligence about something very strange. American tank positions that seemed suspicious, vehicles that didn't move quite right, something that seemed like it might be a German trap. The irony was exquisite. The Ghost Army found itself in the position of having to convince their own allies that their fake tanks were supposed to be fake, without revealing to the French resistance exactly why they were fake. It required delicate handling and added another layer of complexity to an already complex operation. Then came the moment that would become Ghost Army legend. On the third day of Operation Elephant, something extraordinary happened. A German staff car, probably on reconnaissance, drove directly into their position. The Ghost Army soldiers froze. This was the nightmare scenario: direct enemy contact with their rubber arsenal. The German officer stepped out of his vehicle, looked around at the American tanks, studied the position for a long moment, then got back in his car and drove away. The Ghost Army soldiers held their breath, waiting for artillery to rain down, for the deception to be exposed, but nothing happened. Later intelligence suggested that the German officer had reported finding an American dummy position, a decoy designed to draw German fire away from the real tanks. He'd been too clever by half, assuming the Americans were using crude dummies when in fact they were using sophisticated ones. The Ghost Army's deception was so good it had fooled the enemy into thinking they'd discovered a deception. The ultimate validation of their illusion came from the Luftwaffe, German planes, conducting strafing runs on what they believed to be American armour, peppered the Ghost Army position with machine gun fire. The soldiers dove for cover, but the inflatable tanks responded in their own unique way. The bullets passed through the rubber, creating small holes that immediately began to self-seal thanks to the low pressure and flexible material. From the air, it must have looked miraculous. American tanks taking direct hits without apparent damage. German pilots returned to base with wild stories of new American armour that seemed impervious to machine gun fire. Intelligence reports from the period, captured after the war, show German speculation about revolutionary American armour technology. The Ghost Army had accidentally created a myth of invincible tanks, all because their fake ones had the peculiar property of healing themselves. For 4 days and nights, the Ghost Army maintained their illusion. They moved their inflatable tanks periodically, creating the impression of an active, functioning armoured unit. They broadcast their sonic programs on careful schedules, maintenance sounds during the day, movement at night, always varying the program to avoid the telltale repetition that would mark it as a recording. Radio operators created false networks of communication, mimicking the chatter of a division at rest but ready for action. When Operation Elephant concluded, the results were mixed but educational. German intelligence had been successfully confused about the location of the 2nd Armoured Division, but not as completely as hoped. the operation revealed flaws in execution, coordination, and security. But it also proved the fundamental concept. A small unit of artists and engineers could indeed create the illusion of a force 30 times their size. More importantly, they had learned the paradoxical art of imperfect perfection. A good deception, they realized, wasn't about creating a flawless illusion. It was about creating an illusion with just enough flaws to be believable, just enough visibility to be discovered, just enough activity to seem real without seeming staged. They were learning to think like directors, but directors whose audience was trying to kill them. As they packed up their rubber army and prepared for their next performance, the men of the Ghost Army had been blooded, not in the traditional military sense, but in their own unique form of combat. They had faced the enemy not with bullets, but with bollards of hot air. They had learned that on the battlefield, imagination required not just creativity, but courage. The reviews from their opening night were mixed, but the show would go on. Each performance would be better than the last, each deception more sophisticated, until they would reach their magnum opus on the banks of the Rhine. But first, they had many more acts to perfect, many more lessons to learn about the strange art of fighting a war with fakery. By March 1945, the Ghost Army had become seasoned performers. 20 operations had honed their skills, teaching them the delicate balance between revelation and concealment, between too much and too little. They had fooled Germans in France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, but nothing had prepared them for the sheer scale of what was being asked of them now. Operation Viersen, the very name would come to represent the pinnacle of battlefield deception. The Rhine River stood before the Allied forces like a moat protecting the German heartland. Crossing it would be bloody, dangerous, and decisive. The Ninth Army was preparing to make that crossing, but first, they needed the Germans looking in the wrong direction. The assignment was staggering in its ambition. 1,100 men of the Ghost Army would need to impersonate 2 entire divisions. The 30th and the 79th Infantry. That's 40,000 soldiers. 40,000. The mathematics alone were absurd. Each Ghost Army soldier would need to create the impression of 36 men. It was like asking a high school drama club to perform all of Shakespeare's plays simultaneously. But the Ghost Army had learned much since those early days in Normandy. They approached Operation Viersen like master magicians preparing for the performance of their lives. Every detail was choreographed, every element designed to build upon the others, creating a tapestry of deception so rich that even they were impressed by their own audacity. The build-up began on March 18th, 1945. Like stagehands preparing for the world's most dangerous theatrical production, they began constructing their masterpiece. 600 inflatable vehicles were deployed across a massive area, not just tanks this time, but an entire combined arms force. Rubber artillery pieces were positioned with mathematical precision. Inflatable trucks created fake supply lines. Even aircraft, inflatable L-5 observation planes, were added to the mix, because details mattered. The sonic unit outdid themselves. Working in shifts around the clock, that they broadcast a symphony of military preparation. During daylight hours, the sounds of construction filled the air, the distinctive noise of engineers building pontoon bridges, the clatter of materials being unloaded, the shouted commands of work crews. The Germans, listening from across the Rhine, heard exactly what they expected to hear from a force preparing a major river crossing. At night, the audio program shifted. Now it was the rumble of arriving convoys, hundreds of vehicles moving into position under cover of darkness. The Ghost Army operators had learned to vary their programs, to add imperfections, a truck backfiring here, a driver grinding gears there. They had discovered that it was these small mistakes that sold the illusion. Perfect sound was suspicious. Imperfect sound was human. The special effects team elevated their craft to an art form. Fake command posts were established, complete with all the radio antennas, vehicle parks, and foot traffic of genuine headquarters. But here's where the Ghost Army's theatrical training truly shone. They understood that the best way to hide something is to pretend to hide it badly. So they camouflaged their positions, but not too well. They posted guards around sensitive areas, but made sure those guards were visible. They created the impression of an army trying to conceal itself but not quite succeeding. Exactly what German intelligence expected to see from the Americans preparing a major offensive. The attention to detail was obsessive. Soldiers calculated how much laundry 40,000 men would generate and hung appropriate amounts on clotheslines. They figured out how many kitchen fires would be burning, how many latrine facilities would be needed, how many tyre tracks would crisscross a bivouac area of that size. They even factored in the small things. Soldiers reading letters from home, maintenance crews working on vehicles, all the mundane activities that make a military unit feel alive. The radio operators of the Signal Company Special performed their own virtuoso performance. They had spent months studying the radio operators of the 30th and 79th Divisions, learning their distinctive fists, the unique rhythm and style each operator brought to their Morse code transmissions. Now they impersonated them flawlessly, creating networks of false communication that hummed with authentic-sounding military traffic. But perhaps the most audacious element of Operation Viersen was the decision to impersonate specific high-ranking officers, Ghost Army soldiers, chosen for their ability to project authority, donned the insignia of colonels and generals. They made themselves visible in nearby towns, drove through the countryside in marked command vehicles, and generally acted like senior officers trying and failing to maintain a low profile. The performance reached its crescendo on the nights of March 21st and 22nd. The sonic units broadcast the sounds of a massive military build-up reaching its final stages. Flashpots simulated the muzzle flashes of artillery registration. Radio traffic increased dramatically, suggesting final coordination before a major assault. Every element of the deception pointed to one conclusion. The Americans were about to cross the Rhine here, at this exact spot, with overwhelming force. Meanwhile, 60 miles to the north, the real Ninth Army moved into position with actual stealth, their movements masked by the spectacular distraction the Ghost Army was providing. The Germans took the bait completely. Intelligence reports from the period captured after the war show that German commanders fully believed in the presence of 2 additional American divisions preparing to cross at the Ghost Army's location. Wehrmacht units were shifted to meet this phantom threat. Artillery was positioned to rain death on rubber tanks. Reserves were held in place to counter an assault that existed only in the imagination of 1,100 artists. When the real Ninth Army crossed the Rhine on March 24th, they met surprisingly light resistance. The German forces that should have been waiting for them were 60 miles away, staring across the water at an army made of hot air and sound waves. The crossing was accomplished with what official reports called astonishingly low casualties, lives saved by the Ghost Army's grand illusion. The aftermath of Operation Viersen brought something the Ghost Army hadn't experienced before: recognition. Lieutenant General William H. Simpson, commander of the Ninth Army, sent a commendation praising their careful planning, minute attention to detail, and diligent execution. Intelligence officers confirmed that the deception had materially assisted in the successful crossing. But even as they celebrated this triumph, the Ghost Army maintained their performance. German shells, fired at their phantom positions, needed to be answered. When shrapnel punctured their inflatable vehicles, soldiers scrambled to patch and reinflate them, maintaining the illusion even under fire. When a German artillery barrage targeted their motor pool, they broadcast the sounds of damage assessment and repair work. The show, as they say, must go on. Operation Viersen represented the full evolution of the Ghost Army's art. They had progressed from the fumbling improvisations of Normandy to this, a deception so complete, so convincing, that it influenced the course of a major military operation. They had proven that creativity could be just as decisive as firepower, that imagination could shape reality on the battlefield. As they began to pack up their rubber division, deflating tanks and rolling up speakers for what would prove to be one of their final performances, the men of the Ghost Army had achieved something remarkable. They had turned the very nature of warfare on its head. In a conflict defined by destruction, they had wielded creation. In a war of bitter realities, they had mastered the art of illusion. But their greatest vanishing act was yet to come. The war in Europe ended not with a bang, but with paperwork. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, the men of the Ghost Army faced a peculiar situation. Other units were celebrating their victories, sharing war stories, preparing to tell their families about their service. The Ghost Army received different orders. Forget everything. Say nothing. Speak to no one. Your service is now classified. Your stories are now secrets. Your war, officially, never happened. The security briefings were thorough and sobering. The techniques they had pioneered, the army explained, were too valuable to reveal. The Cold War was already taking shape, and American military planners believed these methods of deception might be needed against a new enemy. The Ghost Army's success had, ironically, imprisoned them. They were victims of their own effectiveness, and so began what veterans would later call their second war, the War of Silence. These men who had spent months creating elaborate false narratives were now forced to create one more, the fiction of their own ordinary service. When asked what they did in the war, they gave vague answers. Camouflage, some would say. Engineering support. Others might offer, all true in a way, but nowhere near the whole truth. Picture Bill Blass, returning to New York, unable to tell anyone that he had helped fool the Wehrmacht with inflatable tanks. Imagine Ellsworth Kelly, beginning his art career, carrying the secret of how he had painted rubber artillery to look weathered and battle-worn. Consider Arthur Singer, sketching birds for field guides, remembering the watercolours he had painted between deception operations, unable to explain why he knew so much about the French countryside. For some, the burden was heavier than for others. When veterans sought benefits from the Veterans Administration for service-related injuries or conditions, they faced an impossible situation. How do you prove your service caused your problems when you're legally forbidden from describing your service? The framework for this catch-22 was clear. The VA required evidence linking disabilities to specific military events. The Ghost Army's secrecy oath forbade them from providing exactly that evidence. The psychological toll was particularly cruel. Many Ghost Army veterans struggled with what we now know as PTSD, not from traditional combat, but from the unique stresses of their service. Imagine the mental strain of maintaining a massive deception while under enemy fire, of knowing that one mistake could lead to the deaths of thousands, of spending months in a constant state of theatrical performance where the stakes were measured in lives. And then imagine being unable to explain any of this to a VA psychiatrist, unable to even name the source of your nightmares. Family gatherings became exercises in creative omission. Children asked their fathers about the war and received carefully edited responses. Wives wondered why their husbands sometimes laughed at news reports about military deception, but knew better than to ask. The men who had mastered the art of deception were now forced to practice it on those they loved most. They aged, as all soldiers do. They built careers, raised families, lived their lives. But they carried with them this strange secret, this improbable chapter of their youth when they had fought a war with rubber and recordings. Some must have wondered if anyone would ever believe it, even if they could tell it. The reunion circuit, that great tradition of military units, was complicated for the Ghost Army. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, Ghost Army veterans organised what they had to call an informal gathering in Princeton, New Jersey. For the first time, many of them broke their silence, not to the world, but to their own families. Veterans who had deflected questions for 4 decades finally sat down with their wives and children and told them the truth. They talked about inflatable tanks and sonic deception, about fooling the Wehrmacht and saving lives with imagination. One can only imagine those conversations. Adult children learning that their father hadn't been a paper pusher, but a combat con artist. Wives finally understanding why their husbands had always been so good at keeping secrets. The Princeton gathering became not just a reunion, but a collective unburdening, a chance to finally share the weight of a secret carried too long. Decades passed, the Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War ended. Still, the official secret held. It wasn't until 1985 that the first crack appeared in the Wall of Silence. Arthur Shilstone, Ghost Army veteran and illustrator, shared his story in Smithsonian Magazine. It was like a small pebble thrown into a vast pond. The ripples were subtle but significant. Finally, in 1996, more than 50 years after their rubber tanks had rolled through France, the United States Army declassified the Ghost Army's records. The secret keepers were free to speak, but by then, many were gone, their stories buried with them. Others found that after 50 years of silence, the words didn't come easily. It took determined effort by filmmakers, historians, and the veterans themselves to piece together the full story. Rick Byers' documentary brought their tale to PBS in 2013. Museum exhibits followed. Slowly, the Ghost Army emerged from the shadows, their incredible story finally finding its audience. At a 2013 museum exhibition opening, one veteran, after decades of telling people he had pushed papers during the war, stood before a display about Operation Viersen. Looking at the maps and photographs, seeing his secret finally revealed to the world, he turned to his family with tears in his eyes and said, "I spent 70 years telling people I pushed papers in the war. Turns out, I pushed pattern across Europe." The culmination came on February 1st, 2022, when President Joe Biden signed legislation awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. In March 2024, in a ceremony at the US Capitol, the few surviving members finally received the recognition they had earned 8 decades earlier. Standing there, medals in hand, these men in their 90s and hundreds represented something profound. They were living proof that warfare isn't always about destruction, that sometimes the most powerful weapon is imagination, that creativity can triumph over force. They had fought a war unlike any other, saved thousands of lives with their deceptions, and then kept the secret for half a century. The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond their wartime service. They demonstrated that in the modern world, perception can be as important as reality, that controlling what your enemy believes can be more decisive than controlling territory. Their techniques, refined and updated, remain part of military doctrine. In an age of information warfare, their analog deceptions seem almost quaint, yet the principles they established, the weaponization of belief, the strategic use of misdirection, have never been more relevant. But perhaps their most enduring lesson is more personal. The men of the Ghost Army showed us that artists make unlikely but effective warriors, that creativity is its own form of courage, that there are many ways to serve one's country. They remind us that history is full of secret chapters, untold stories waiting to be discovered, and that sometimes the most fantastic tales are the ones that happen to be true. So rest now, in the quiet after the storm of this improbable story. Rest knowing that somewhere in the archives of military history stands proof that 1,100 artists once went to war, armed with imagination, and came home victorious. Rest in the certainty that sometimes, just sometimes, the pen really is mightier than the sword, especially when that pen is sketching inflatable tanks. The Ghost Army saved lives by creating lies. They won battles by staging shows. They served their country by fooling its enemies. And then, in their greatest performance of all, they vanished into silence for 50 years. keeping safe the secrets of their improbable war until the world was finally ready to hear them. Their stage was a battlefield. Their audience was the enemy. Their reviews came in the form of intelligence reports and casualty figures, and their final curtain call came decades after their last performance, in the halls of Congress, where a grateful nation finally said what should have been said in 1945. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your secrets. Thank you for showing us that sometimes the most powerful thing on a battlefield is the ability to make the enemy see something that isn't there. The inflatable invasion was over, but the story, strange, inspiring, and absolutely true, will drift on through history, a reminder that in the darkest of times, human creativity can still find a way to save lives and light the way forward, even if that light is coming from a speaker playing the sound of tanks that don't exist, across a battlefield populated by an army of ghosts.